Remember what day this is, but this is the Ickdame Burnout series. And today I'm looking at the 12 stages of burnout. This is like a fundamental episode. So one of the things that occurred to me that obviously we've spoken about what burnout is. We've talked about the definition before, the three elements of it being emotional exhaustion, depersonalization, and reduced feeling of accomplishment. Talked about overwhelm, but what we haven't talked about is what the actual stages are. So, and there's 12 of them, depending on which version you look at. There's two, and I'll maybe do another one which is looking at the other one, which has 5 stages, and those are more generalized, but give you an idea of where you might be. The 12 I wanted to start with because it's a bit of a deep dive. I'll try and be as brief as possible, but with enough information for you to know how it works. The main reason I'm doing this is because I feel like it's important to understand what the warning signs are. And the more we understand the span of burnout, the more we can realize, okay, cool, this is what I'm actually experiencing, and this is what this might be attached to. Let me just put this in here. Cool. What it might be attached to. So 12 stages. We're going to go through them. And one of the things I want to point out is when we get to number 5, I'm going to slow down a little bit for that one, because that is one that I don't think we talk about enough, but is a really important shift that happens on your way towards burnout that I feel like can accelerate that journey, which is not what we want to do. Okay, so the first stage, number 1, is the need to prove yourself. So this is the idea that you might experience things like self-doubt, perfectionism, negative self-talk, and it's this idea that you must do better or you must do more, right? So this is what starts you off on that road. And it might not even necessarily just be with work. It might be with anything. Okay, something happens on the global scale and you feel like you need to be part of solving the problem, even though you're doing 1,000 things already. Something happens at home and you feel like you are not doing what you need to be doing. Something happens at work and you feel like you need to extend yourself to be able to manage this extra load, even though it's not your responsibility to do so. It might not even be in your job description, right? So you start to feel the need to prove yourself. And the thing is, like, I had a conversation recently about perfectionism. And one of the things about perfectionism, we know that perfection doesn't exist. Logically speaking, we know that perfection is. And what we find, we create this idea of ourselves, of who we are, and it's part of our identity that is impossible to reach. We are constantly going to be falling short of that idea of ourselves. And we can end up using that idea against ourselves, which can have a negative effect on us in the long run. So it's important to understand, like, I see perfectionism seen as such a, I don't know, it's celebrated, but it's actually self-destructive a lot of the time. So, and it can be, it can lead on to this, like, I should be up here, but I feel like I'm down here. Of course, you're here, you're human. This doesn't exist. But if we continue to compare ourselves to this thing, we're always going to feel like we need to do more. And we always finding ourselves chasing our tail of things. And if you think about it logically as well, a perfectionist, even when they perceive perfection, will imagine an idea even greater that they could have reached. I could have done this, or I should have done this, or I would have done this if. So you never actually reach that stage anyway. So then you start to create more capacity for yourself to fill, and you lead down this road. The next step leading on from that is becoming a workaholic, or becoming constantly overloading yourself. And this is actually tied to the overwhelm idea that we create ourselves sometimes. Sometimes there might be external factors that create a scenario which we can't live up to, but oftentimes we create it for ourselves. I was in a talk recently and we talked about how the person was trying to change their circumstances, right? They wanted to get to a certain stage of life, which was fine, but part of that journey was they felt like, and that there was a term they came up with, which was, I had no choice. Yes, we do. A lot of the times we actually do. And once we actually sat down and unpacked, we realized there was a choice, but there was something about her internally that felt like she needed to make this choice, and she needed to add on these things, and she needed to do X, Y, and Z. And we realized that it's actually not an issue with the tasks or the things that she was facing, because she didn't need to take on so much, right? But it was actually something about her that felt like she needed to. And sometimes this subconscious issue, or this relationship with ourselves, our what's the word I'm looking for? Our self-image, could influence how we manage ourselves and under these circumstances, right? So becoming a workaholic can lead on from the idea of feeling like you need to do more. The third stage of burnout, and I wouldn't necessarily say these are linear. You might be able to move back and forth. You might find yourself jumping from 2 to 6 and back down to 3, for example. But the third stage here is neglecting your self-care and your own needs. And so this is one of the things where we start to see this happening, right? So you don't eat properly, you don't hydrate yourself, you don't sleep or enough, right? All the things that you should do to keep yourself in a healthy state, you don't do anymore. You've stopped going to the gym, you've stopped exercising, you've stopped speaking to your friends and family. All the things that you need, you stop doing. And it can be dangerous, because what can end up happening is you actually have health conditions that can happen as a result of that. Increased rate of heart disease, higher blood pressure, chronic stress, depression, anxiety, insomnia, physical collapse happen when you stop prioritizing yourself, and all the habits, the healthy habits that you've been having that have kept you in a high state. And we realize sometimes a bit too late that we've been neglecting all of that and our own needs. So stage number 4 is when things start to be shown outwards with other people, right? So this is conflict with others. So you've got a stage where you are trying to do too much, right? So stage 1 is when you try to prove yourself. You think to yourself, well, you need to be doing more. Stage 2 is when you start to actually do more, and you increase your workload and start to overwhelm yourself. Because you're overwhelming yourself, you start to neglect all the basic things that you actually need, and your self-care. You might not even be washing, and in the pandemic, or stayed in their onesie for 3-4 days. You'd stop brushing your teeth, all those basic things. And then you start to have conflict with others. You become irritable. And of course, you're irritable. You haven't eaten properly in the last while. You haven't slept properly. You haven't been able to sustain your self practices that keep you joyful. You're not doing your morning routine, your evening routine anymore. So when you're interacting with people, you're more irritable. You're impatient. You find yourself flaring up, right? And this is a difficult one, because this is when you start to realize some real change is happening, and other people might notice it before you, but you start to change. You start to see yourself in conflicts a lot more, right? Stage 5, now I mentioned this before, is one of the important ones that I'll slow down for. This is where you start reevaluating your values, right? And in a way, this is connected to stage 3, when you start neglecting your needs. Let's say, for example, your values are family, right? You come from a really tight family background. You may live with your extended family. You might have your grandparents living with you. You might have your cousins and stuff, and all that kind of stuff. Or friends, for example, is a really good one. Like, these are really valuable things in your life, things that you revere, to things that keep you stable, right? Reevaluating your values is when you start to take so much at work, for example, that the work becomes more priority, a higher priority than your family. You start to sacrifice the time that you're meant to spend with your family and replace it with more work. For example, right, in a work example, you start to reevaluate your values. The reason why I wanted to slow down for this is because I don't think we talk about this enough. When a wise person once said to me, if you want to see what your priorities are, look at how you're spending your time. So if I say that my values are self-care, but I have started to put work above self-care, or I've started to put the needs of someone else above my own self-care, I've started to put the needs of the nation above my own self-care, right? So I'm now working 15 hours a week volunteering, which means that I don't eat properly, or I don't even shower in the morning. I just have to jump straight out and go to this place. All those things become above your values, and that can shift you off. And it can be like a set off to accelerate you towards burnout, right? I've said, for example, one of the examples might be putting your family on the back burner to focus on work, but it might also be making career decisions that override your personal values and beliefs. It might be taking this job because of the money when it's doing something that you don't agree with, right? Or helping someone for a company that you don't believe in. It might be focusing on short-term goals, gains instead of the long-term effects, right? So it's like, for example, if you're starving and you haven't eaten and you're in the desert, you're going to end up eating all these things, that whatever you can get your hands on. You're not thinking about the long-term effects because you don't have that privilege anymore, right? When you start hurtling towards burnout, you start looking at what is immediately in front of you instead of the long-term effects of things, right? So yeah, okay, I'm going to do this now. I'll do that later. Well, no, the thing that we're pushing off to do later is probably what we need to do now. So, for example, um, I've got this. There's an opportunity to do this extra work because one of my colleagues is really struggling. So I'm going to take on their work, right? That's a short-term gain. I wasn't asked to do it. And I didn't go to my line manager and explain the situation about them to see if anyone else in the team can spread out the load. But I decided I am going to take this on. And what that ends up meaning is that I have to take it home after work, which means that I don't spend as much time with my family and my friends, and I don't do my self-care routine. And I end up not sleeping because it ends up taking me over to stupid times of the morning, right? You start to prioritize your short-term goals over your long-term effects. And it's a really important one I wanted to stress because I see this happen a lot when something else, your priorities shift as a result of how we're handling what's happening right now. And we don't realize it's happening a lot of the time. And this leads up to number 6 in terms of the stages of burnout is deny our emerging problems. Someone starts to notice and we say, no, that's not happening. That's not what this is. A stage of denial is so important. We see it in all kinds of stuff. There's a stage of denial in grief. There's a stage of denial in recovery of anything, like Alcoholics Anonymous, for example. There's a stage of denial in there. All this stuff is really important because things are happening that other people are noticing, and even we deep down might be noticing, but we tell ourselves it's not happening. And this might be because there's a conflict, right? There might be something where you think to yourself, I am not the kind of person who experiences this. And if that's the case, then when you start to experience it, you might deny it to keep that image of yourself strong. But what you don't realize it's doing is actually detrimental because it means holding off the opportunity to get help. It means not speaking to your friends and family about it, even though it's really affecting you. When you're in denial, it's similar to displacement. It can make you detach from the reality of what's going on, right? And it's really important to look at because it can also show in signs of aggression, intolerance, hostility at your professional and home life, right? So you might feel like people are against you, right? People are attacking you, people are challenging you, when actually they're trying to help you, right? So it's important to be aware if things start to happen, am I actually experiencing this? Is it possible that this could be what's going on? And if that's the case, what would that mean for me? As opposed to, no, you're lying, because then that doesn't help. The seventh stage of burnout is withdrawal. So imagine you start to realize that these people are, you're denying that there's a problem, and you withdraw. So this is one that's really, really common, actually. This is something I see a lot, especially with the people who are givers, for example, or the people who are always there and take other people's burdens, but struggle to the idea of being a burden to someone else. And so they don't go to people for help. They end up suffering in silence. So you're overwhelmed, you're emotionally exhausted, you're doing all this stuff. And instead of speaking to your friends for help, going to professional help, you just stop going to social events. You stay at home all day. You start to wallow in that emotion, and it starts to become heavy. And the problem is, it becomes a cycle, right? And it's a negative one. Something is happening, you don't get help, and so you try to deal with it yourself, but it's not something that you should really be dealing with yourself. So it's too much to bear, and you continue to fall down the spiral where no one has seen you for like a week now. People start getting worried, they start to message you, and you see all these messages build up on your inbox. They're actually people who are looking for you to help. But just the idea of seeing 12 unread messages starts adding to your overwhelm. So you stop answering your phone at all, right? Withdrawal is a real thing. Stage 8 of burnout is behavioral changes. This is when things start, when you really start to notice that things are changing, right? We mentioned before that there are certain things that other people might notice. This is the point where you stop, you get to the point where you can't ignore things anymore. You start to, this is where things like depression, anxiety, oversleeping, or insomnia. So we've mentioned insomnia before. Often it's you think to yourself, okay, I can't sleep. So you have 2-3 hours of sleep a day, if at all, right? But oversleeping is also a sign of burnout. So instead of having the 8 hours, you're having 12 hours, right? And you need naps 2 or 3 times a day to be able to function, right? You withdraw from social activities. You have less of an interest in your hobbies, the things that used to bring you joy, and you start acting out of character, right? This is leading on to number 9, which is depersonalization. But you start to change, right? And there's fundamental changes as well. So things that weren't important to you become important to you, and things that weren't important to you become important to you now, right? And you start to so for example, my mum was the one that point, right? So the only time that she ever sees me frustrated or sharp or speaking back to her or anything like that. Anyone knows from an African background, speaking back to your parents is a no-no, right? But the only time I would ever do that is when I haven't eaten. And there's things that happen biologically that happen as a result of that. It's not just a matter of being hungry. Your behavior changes. And it's the same thing with burnout. You start to experience all these things, you're taking on too much, and we don't make the connections between the fact that we're taking on too much, not just in terms of tasks, but in terms of emotion, burdens, all these kind of stuff, things that are on our mind that we're like, oh, I need to fix this, or this is a terrible thing that's happening in the world. But internally, I take that on as my responsibility. All these things weigh down on us. We're experiencing grief or trauma that we haven't dealt with. All these things pile on, and our body is fighting to deal with that. And it shows up by us showing behavioral changes, right? So I'm going to go on to number 9, which is depersonalization. And this is one that can be difficult to explain, but this is how we're going to try. Depersonalization is when you become detached from your emotions completely, and you feel like you're watching it from the outside, right? You stop to feel your emotions. This is when you start to the decline in emotion begins, right? So you may have reached your capacity and then it shuts off. One of the examples I give is that I used to talk about this fizzy bottle experience. If you take a fizzy bottle each time someone does something to you or you get triggered or something like that, it's like shaking that fizzy bottle. During the day, you might have 12, 15, 150 shakes to the point where the pressure in the bottle builds up. And then two things are going to happen. Either the bottle will explode or the water will go flat. Depersonalization is when the bottle starts going flat, right? So we've already talked about behavioral changes where the bottle explodes, you get irritable, etc. Then it goes flat. So you become removed from your own emotions and thoughts. And you might find that it's almost like you're in robot mode, like you're just watching the world go by. This is when you start to become distanced from reality. And you might feel like you're on autopilot. That's the word I was looking for, autopilot. And 2 or 3 days might disappear and you're like, oh, where did the time go? This is when you really start to experience depersonalization, right? The next one is number 10 in terms of the stages of burnout, and there's 12. We're almost there. Thank you for keeping up so far. Is feeling inner emptiness. So this is when you completely emotional capacity. We talked about depersonalization be that beginning towards in your emotions, but inner emptiness is when you completely run out, you're drained completely. You've cared too much for too long, and now there's nothing left. This is when you start to feel like a shell of yourself. This is when in the cartoons, for example, where their eyes turn black or they start getting deep bags under their eyes and they're just drooling and just they're zombies at this point. And you feel empty. You feel a lack of passion and a lack of purpose, right? You start thinking, what's the point? Yeah, so you might have lost fulfillment in the things that usually bring you fulfillment at this point, right? And this is when we start to see people who, okay, so and this bit is really important, right? So you feel empty and there's a need to fill it, right? And this is what ends up happening when you're at this stage. A lot of people, when they start to feel complete inner emptiness, try to fill it by any means necessary. And this is when when you start to see people using unhealthy coping mechanisms. They start to go to binge eating or alcohol or drugs or sex or anything like that to just feel something. And if you're experiencing this is a sign of burnout as well. We've talked about it being a change in behavior. It might not be like you to be going down this road. Or like, for example, that one glass of red wine towards the end of the day becomes one bottle, right? These things start to escalate towards this destructive side of things. And this might be the difficult thing about this is it's often the stuff we do at home alone that accelerates this element when it comes to inner emptiness. And the stage 11, which is right next there, is depression. So this is the point where you're empty at this point, right? And it's prolonged over that period of time. So it's not just feeling sad. Depressed is a completely different issue. It's a medical issue at this point, right? It's about your hormones. It's about your ability to feel. It's about your ability to feel connected to people and things. It's when you lose the ability for all of those stuff, it combines to form this thing that we call depression, right? You might feel a struggle to get out of bed in the morning, and you might feel things that you once enjoyed, you don't enjoy anymore, and you don't even want to do things anymore, right? You might find it difficult to concentrate. You might find it difficult to make decisions just in general. And at this point, I would say is start thinking about, and if you haven't started thinking about it already, start thinking about professional help. Do you need a therapist? Do you need a coach? Do you need to go to your GP, right? Sometimes friends and family have certain capacities to help, and we need to feel connected, right? For example, with me, one of the things I used to do is spend more time with people I love, right? And we don't even necessarily need to be doing too much. We can be sitting in silence, but just being in a room with people can help, right? But when those things stop helping, and when you start to go to the unhealthy coping mechanisms, when you start to feel depressed over prolonged periods of time and you can't get yourself out of it, then we need to seek professional help. And there's no shame in that. One of the things I find as a being in the Black community, it's not necessarily to like cast us this way, but there's something that happens culturally back home where we consider this mental health thing culturally as something that we don't take seriously, and it's almost binary. You're either okay or you're crazy. And I think we need to scrap that. We need to realize that mental health is a scale. It's a whole diagram of emotions and things. You might be really strong in one area but really need attention in another area. And it's not to say that anything is right or wrong with you. It's just that, like your physical health, sometimes we have ups and downs. But if we don't understand that certain things need to be addressed, then we'll find ourselves hurtling towards the extreme sides of these experiences, to the point where we'll really find it difficult to claw our way back if we're too far down that road. The final stage of burnout is number 12. This is what we call full-blown burnout syndrome, right? So yeah, definitely, Michelle. It's something that we need to always work on and develop. And we talked about, I said it earlier on, burnout isn't necessarily, these 12 stages of burnout aren't necessarily linear, right? They kind of mold into each other. They might jump back and forth. But what we need to do is be aware of ourselves. We need to be paying attention to our behaviors, any changes that we're happening physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually. Pay attention to those things and deal with them early. Don't let it get to stage 12 before we start thinking, oh, okay, I need to do something about this. I'm covered in, scars, and I've been, being destructive to myself, etc. Try and deal with it early, the moment to feel the change. Don't wait. Right? So like I said, the full-blown burnout syndrome is stage 12. And this one has serious consequences, right? It can lead to mental and physical collapse, and you can literally switch off. This is when people start to find themselves in hospital, right? So you literally switch off. Your body has reached its capacity. You haven't been listening, and it's shut itself down, right? So this is where you might have psychosis. You might have other kind of mental disorders might show up, or like I said, you might faint or collapse, or you might find yourself in spasms. This is where the physical manifestations of burnout start to really show, and in a dangerous way, right? And it might have it happen in a time when you don't have control over it, right? So at this point, there's physical exhaustion, mental confusion, emotional numbness, right? If you're doing a work that's manual labor kind of thing, this is the one where you have those stories of people who work on machines and they end up smashing a hammer through their hand, for example, and or even worse, like someone might die as a result of a mistake that happens at work, or you like I said before, things like spasms, things like collapse, things like finding yourselves in hospital, right? And this is one where it's like the flags, if they were red before, now they are burning, right? Um, what else to say about this? I think at this point, when you're here, is just go to your GP. At this point, just go to the hospital, put yourself into A&E, and let them. And this is where as well the how would I put this? There's a stage of burnout where when you're at this level, things like self-care aren't going to get you out of it. There's a stage of burnout where you might need um, medical hormonal interjection. You might need some kind of therapy. You might need medication. You might need something to drastically change to stop you from hitting that wall. And again, looking at our perception of mental health, it's important for us not to demonize that. If we need help, we need help. There's something that has internally that has meant that we haven't been able to, or we just haven't stopped towards burnout this far. Once we're at this stage, it's a life and death issue. And if we want to get to a stage where we see tomorrow and we're able to pick up the mantle and be there for ourselves or other people, then we need to have something drastic happen to change this cycle. And one of the things that we sometimes find, and I mentioned there's another version of the burnout cycle, which I'll do on another day, which has 5 stages, but it's where you get habitual burnout. So you find yourself in the cycle. Okay, cool. So you find yourself at this stage and then you do something about it. There's like a drastic change. You're like, I need to do something now. And you start doing the things that you should have really been doing at the beginning, and you start to feel better. And then once you feel better, you're like, oh, I can take on more stuff again. And then the cycle continues. I've got a comment here that says prevention is better than cure. Absolutely. We should not wait till we get to that stage before we seek help. 100%. But we see it happening all the time, right? So we see ourselves, even ourselves, if we look back, there's often times where we find ourselves in a situation where in hindsight, there was something we could have done earlier on that would have stopped us reaching that stage. We'll go through it. And again, it's not demonizing this, it's just being more aware of it. My role as a coach that helps people recover from burnout is also recover from it enough that we put things in place to avoid it happening again, or at least start catching it at the early stages next time. And just to recap, I'm just going to go through the 12 stages again so you're familiar. Is number one is needing to prove yourself, having this idea of perfectionism that tells you that you need to be doing more in the first place. Number two is becoming a workaholic or increasing your workload. Number one was I need to do more. Number two is actually doing more and feeling overwhelmed. Number three is neglecting your self-care. So you start to stop doing the things that actually keep you healthy and keep your capacity to do things. Number four is conflict with others, right? You start to snap at people, you start to be irritable, you start to lose your patience. Number five is reevaluating your values. So all the things that mean something to you start to fall in the value system, and you start to prioritize things like work over your family, and you start to have longer nights and stuff, or staying, taking your work home, or I don't know, putting other people's needs above yours. Number six is denial, right? So people start to say something's going on and you're denying it completely because you don't believe it to be true or you don't want it to be true. But then it means that you don't seek help as a result. Number seven is withdrawal, right? So you start to decide that you're going to deal with it yourself, or you just don't have the capacity for social interactions anymore as a result of that, conflict with others, and you've changed your value system. So now you don't care about your family and friends anymore, and you're denying there being any change to your behavior at all, right? So that's, you start to withdraw, and you don't want to be a burden to other people, for example, and so you start to try and deal with it yourself. Number eight is odd behavioral changes. So this is when you start to act completely differently, and people start to notice you're experiencing anxiety and you're snapping at people. There's anger issues when you're usually the calm one, all that kind of stuff. Depersonalization is when you start to feel detached from yourself and reality. You start to feel like you're in robot mode, autopilot, and you're watching things happen as an out of body experience, and you start to lose connection emotionally with the things that are happening around you. Number 10 is feeling in the emptiness. This is when you're completely drained of emotion and there's nothing less left. You've lost your passion and you've lost your purpose. And you're thinking, what's the point? Right? Then 11 is depression, prolonged feelings of this, right? Where it's not just being sad, but it's also a medical issue, right? Over a prolonged period of time. And then number 12 is full-blown burnout syndrome, where this is where it becomes medical and it's a state of emergency, and you need to actually go and seek help if you haven't sought help already. And one of the things I'd say at this point, if any of this is familiar to you, because I feel like it happens in so many different places. People who are parents who are struggling to handle children. If you are in the medical profession and you have to take on people's experiences as your own because you care for them while you're trying to help them. People who are in high stress environments at work, for example, or people who deal with communities and you're supporting other people in need. All these kind of people are the kind of people who might be experiencing different stages of burnout at different stages of their life. I've done an example, a talk recently where we talked about triggers and looking at what's happening, what else is happening in our lives that can reduce our capacity to feel or care or function, which can also lead us to burnout. We might be thinking it's one thing when actually it's a combination of things that are happening in our lives at a specific period of time that we can feel like it's coming in from all sides. That can lead to burnout too. All right. If you're experiencing any of this stuff, and I hope by giving the 12 stages, you've been able to say, oh, okay, right now I'm realizing I'm at number 5, for example, right? If you feel yourself in any of the stages of burnout, reflecting on that, where exactly are you? What aren't you doing that could help you get out of it? And if there's something where you genuinely can't do it yourself, seek professional help, right? Find a coach. I'm an executive coach. I quite literally work with people to help people recover from burnout. So if this is something that is useful to you, book a call with me, right? So if you're on LinkedIn or we go here and here, you can book a call with me. If you're on Instagram, DM me. We'll talk. We'll figure out what exactly is going on, what stage you're at, what things you can be doing to help yourself, and give yourself a little to-do list, little homework, something tangible you can do. And if this is something that you long period of time, we can talk about how you can become a client of mine. I usually work on 12-week bases. So over the course of 12 weeks, I have like a program basically where I have a system that I can help you get out of burnout and stay out of burnout. Or it might be a situation where it's just a one-off consultation that you need, or a one-off session that you can book at any time as a drop-in. Or there's resources. So there are things like PDFs that I've produced where I can give it to you to help you, right? And there are other things I'm going to be doing later on as well. But whatever it is, seek help. Try not to get to a stage where you feel so overwhelmed that the worst happens, right? And what we end up happening is if we don't seek help, our bodies will shut down and so will our minds. They'll take it by force. They will try and get your attention the hard way. And we don't want to get to that stage. And don't wait. If you find yourself, if you're listening to this and feeling like there's something happening within your throat or your chest or your stomach, where you're like, oh my gosh, this is something that I'm experiencing right now. And especially if you're starting to feel like an element of panic and you realize something needs to change, do something now. Pick up the phone, drop me a DM, let's talk immediately. Do not wait. I've been to a stage where I've been completely detached. I've been to a stage where I was experiencing things which scared me. And I don't want people to be going through that. So if you're experiencing any of those 12 stages, get in touch with me or any other trained professional. If you're at stage 12, get to your GP. Okay? There's no shame in it. Don't worry about any of that. This is a medical condition that is written about in so many different articles and books. It's all over the place now, right? So we've just come out of a pandemic. We're in the middle of global wars and environmental issues. Individually, you might be going through things that you haven't been able to deal with before. It's completely understandable that you're taking on too much. But what ends up happening if you take on too much and don't deal with it, it builds up within the body, physiologically, as well as emotionally and spiritually, right? So get in touch. Let's help. All right. I think that's it for today. And genuinely speaking, don't let it go 24 hours without seeking help if this is you.